people were already feeling that this was an issue that had important implications for modern national unity. We see that nationalist figures who were, let's say, pro-centralization, so pro-Jakarta, certainly Sukarno, but also non-Javanese people like Muhammad Yamin, often associated with the left or left-leaning, they were very in favor of this idea of Majapahit as a great nation. And part of it is that Sukarno in particular was looking for ways to develop a national identity and pride. And he was very explicit about his mission of nation building, using our symbols, using our historical legacies as a way of empowering Indonesians today and empowering Indonesian nation state at a time when it's fair to say Indonesia was under threat.
Welcome to the third episode of ANUISA Roundtable Talks, the podcast by the Indonesian Student Association at the Australian National University, ANUISA. I'm Nadir.
And I'm Kathleen. In this podcast, we explore deep conversation about Indonesian history, politics, and identity grounded in academic and critical thinking.
Today, we're diving into a topic that sits at the heart of Indonesia's historical imagination. And that is the question, was Majapahit really an empire that unified the whole archipelago?
For many of us, Majapahit represents a golden age of unity and greatness. So it's celebrated in school textbooks, political narratives, and national symbols. But how much of that legacy is based on historical evidence?
And to help unpack this, we're honored to be joined by Dr. Wayan Jarrah Sastrawan, a historian of medieval Southeast Asia and a researcher and lecturer as well at the Australian National University. His work critically examines how pre-modern polities like Majapahit are interpreted and remembered.
In this episode, we'll explore about what the original sources actually say about Majapahit, how the idea of empire may not apply in the way we often think, and how nationalist and colonial frameworks have shaped our understanding of the past.
So whether you're a student, a history enthusiast, or someone curious about the roots of national storytelling, this is a conversation you don't want to miss.
Exactly. To start us off, Dr. Sastrawan, would you mind telling us a little bit about your background? Like, what's your academic background and what makes you focus on the topic of medieval Indonesian or Southeast Asian historiography?
Thank you very much, and I very much appreciate the invitation today to talk about this really important issue. And I'd like to first acknowledge that we're meeting on the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people here at the Acton campus of the ANU, and that as we talk about historical matters, as we talk about sort of the deep past of Indonesia, we also pay respect to the people who have maintained custodianship over this land in Australia for many tens of thousands of years. And we pay respect to their elders, past and present. Thanks very much for inviting me along. To give you a bit of a background, I partly grew up in Indonesia, where I was born in Australia, but I spent much of my early childhood in Indonesia, in Bali, where I lived with my family. So my father's family is Balinese, my mother's family is Australian. And so really my interest in Indonesian history goes all the way back to my childhood. Seeing Balinese culture around me growing up, I was always curious about its origins, being raised in a Hindu family, wanting to understand the nature of that culture. And when I went to school, particularly in SD and primary school, when we began to learn about the history of Indonesia in class, we began to learn about the kingdoms, including Majapahit, but also the earlier kingdoms that built Borobudur and Prambanan, for example. And then we learned about the coming of colonialism from the 16th century onwards. These were lessons that really resonated with me. And at the time, I was interested in history more broadly as well. I was interested in the Roman Empire, I was interested in European history, and it seemed that Indonesian history was just as fascinating, just as rich as other parts of the world.
Mhm.
So really it was a sort of a childhood passion of mine. And when I came to Australia for high school and then on to university, I decided eventually, after doing a number of different things, that I wanted to pursue research in Indonesian history. And so that's really how I came to the field. And then from from my master's onwards and through the PhD, and finally now working as a lecturer, I've maintained this focus on Indonesian history and especially the early periods before modernity.
Okay. So I'd like to ask you the first few questions. I'd like to go into the discussion actually about Majapahit. So, Dr. Sastrawan, to begin, Majapahit, the Majapahit Empire, is often portrayed as a powerful empire that once unified the Indonesian archipelago. This image, at least in Indonesia, appears everywhere, from textbooks, political speeches. My question is, why is it, do you think, that this narrative persists so strongly in the national imagination? And what are really the main claims that shape this popular understanding of the empire?
It's a great question, as we all, those of us who grew up in Indonesia or spend a lot of time in Indonesia, we experience this discourse on a regular basis. The core claims, I think, whether they're implicit or explicit, is that Majapahit was a powerful state with a vast territory, specifically in the 14th century. So we often focus on Majapahit at a particular point in its history, that is during the reign of Hayam Wuruk and during the period in which Prime Minister Gajah Mada was in power. So this is between 1330 to 1364. This is seen to be the period at which Majapahit was most powerful and at which its achievements culturally, politically, were at their greatest height. And the claim is essentially that during this time, Majapahit, as a Javanese kingdom based in East Java, whose capital city was around where the town of Trowulan is today, that it expanded and took over a large number of territories that now compose Indonesia, and also some territories slightly beyond the borders of modern-day Indonesia. But more importantly, that all or most of the territories that we now consider part of the territory of the Republic of Indonesia were brought under the political control of this one state. And that state, therefore, in terms of territorial extent, and to a different extent, to a different degree, in terms of the political culture and the cultural heritage of Majapahit, serves as a precursor. So it serves as an example for modern-day Indonesia. Specifically, the idea that since Majapahit was able to bring political unification to the archipelago with all of its different peoples, all of its different cultures, all of its different islands and environments, an area which is naturally extremely diverse, being brought together under a single unitary state. I think that's the role model that's most important to the nationalist story. That is, we look at Majapahit and we see those particular aspects, and we think that's something which we as Indonesians today want to aspire to. We want to aspire to unity and diversity. We want to express the values encoded in the national motto, Bhinneka Tunggal Ika. And it's important to note that that motto, that phrase, Bhinneka Tunggal Ika, originates from the Majapahit period as well. It comes from a poem called Sudasoma, which expresses, in a different context, this notion that what appears on the surface to be difference of opinion or difference of religious belief, specifically in the original context, the difference between Buddhism and Hinduism, actually beneath the surface is a single truth. That's the message of Bhinneka Tunggal Ika in its original context, and that's been modernized and adapted in nationalist historiography to refer more broadly, right? Despite our different languages, despite our different religions, different ethnicities, we are all essentially one Indonesian people.
There's it. Okay, understand. Yeah, I guess in the context it's also Bhinneka Tunggal Ika, Tanhana Mangrua Dharma. There is no duality or discord in truth. I guess that was the original context that nowadays we use as a symbol, as a phrase of unity.
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
Okay, and building on that, I would like to ask about the idea of empire itself. What do historians really mean when they actually use that term, especially in the Southeast Asian context? And if we apply the lens of Majapahit, what kind of political or cultural influence, if any, did it really have over its maritime neighbors?
These are great questions. So the first thing is that the word empire has many different meanings in different contexts. So there is no single model that we can apply. Even in Europe, the different empires that we know of in the ancient world, for example, were very different to each other. The Roman Empire had a specific model that's very different to the Athenian Empire in ancient Greece. The way in which those were managed and the way in which power was extended is always variable. And so we need to be quite precise when we think about the Southeast Asian context or the Indonesian context. What do we mean when we even say the word? So I think it's good to begin by thinking, what image do we have in our heads when we start saying Majapahit Empire, and then check each of the details of that image with what we can show. So to think about Southeast Asia, the first thing I suppose that's notable about Southeast Asia is it's a highly diverse region. It's geographically quite dispersed in a lot of ways. That is due to the geography, due to the climate, due to the variety of different peoples. It lacks a sort of, I guess, intrinsic unity or uniformity that would allow for large-scale empires. So when Southeast Asian historians talk about empire, we're often talking about an unusually broad extension of power in the Southeast Asian context. So the sort of the default position is small states, relatively non-extensive countries and empires. And when a particular formation occurs that's unusually large and broad, such as the Angkorian Empire, such as the Majapahit Empire, we think that's notable. We take notice of it, like, this is interesting. This is something worthy of attention. Why is it that in a society, in a region where power is generally diffuse, right, that it's not natural for powerful, large hierarchical systems to form? Sometimes they do. On occasion they do, and in those moments we pay attention and we think, here's something that we need to explain. So if we look specifically then at the Majapahit state, again, focusing on this particular period in its history in the mid-14th century, we see that we have a number of different processes going on at the same time that seem to enforce each other. The first is that within Java itself, specifically the Javanese-speaking areas, so Central Java, East Java, we see that the kingdom that's centered on Majapahit is more effectively integrating the countryside than it used to. So if we compare the history of Java from the many centuries before Majapahit, we see that the countryside is usually quite fragmented. There's a lot of sort of autonomous power. The villages have a lot of authority. There are kings, but often they don't last very long, or the dynasties change a lot. In the Majapahit period, comparatively, we see a more centralization of power in the Javanese countryside. And I think that that's an important factor that plays into then how the Javanese relate to people outside of Java. So there is a sense that the Javanese are developing a stronger sense of organization, and therefore able to manage and control resources internally in a more organized and bureaucratic way. this coincides with them having more influence outside of Java. So at this time, as the Javanese are becoming more internally integrated, they're also showing up in other parts of the archipelago having influence. So for example, in Sumatra, we see already from just before the Majapahit period, in the Singosari period, we see Javanese kings giving gifts to the kings of Sumatra in a way that makes it clear that the Javanese king is the most powerful. So a sort of superior subordinate relationship is being formed through this gift giving. In Bali, the closest island to the east of Java, we see very direct involvement of the Majapahit kings in Balinese affairs, often very low-level affairs, but still they take their disputes or their problems all the way to Java and let the Javanese resolve them. So in this period, in the 14th century, we see that the Javanese are having an impact on their neighbors, and in some cases being acknowledged as the superior power by them, like a hegemon, sometimes even directly intervening in their affairs, saying, oh yes, you should do it this way. But it's also always the case that the Javanese see themselves as different to those people. They never want to make those places part of Java, except for Madura. So interestingly, we see a very clear definition of what Java is, which is the Javanese-speaking areas, roughly modern-day Central Java, DIY, and East Java, plus Madura. That's the dalam negeri for the Javanese kingdom. And everything else is luar negeri, outside, and those are the places that are referred to as Nusantara. So if we look at the meaning of the word Nusantara, the original meaning of the word Nusantara, it means the other islands. Yeah. So the meaning of Nusantara, the word Antara in Sanskrit means other. Nusantara is the other places that are not Java. So the Javanese always maintain a very strong distinction between our country, where we speak Javanese, plus Madura, where they speak Madurese, but they're part of us.
Okay.
And everybody else. And then the question of what sort of empire is Majapahit is actually defined as what relationship do the Javanese have to the non-Javanese people around them. And that's something which is different in every case. So it's different in Sumatra, it's different in Bali, it's different in Borneo, it's different in Eastern Indonesia. So we have to look at each case individually to see what the relationship was at different times.
Very interesting. Like, even now, when we're talking about cultural trade, cultural influence, especially the discourse about development and centralization of development, turns out is inevitably goes way back.
Yeah.
It's still influence us.
It is ancient history. Centralization. The first traces of civilization, you have first traces of centralization.
Yeah.
Okay, so Dr. Sastrawan, I want to ask a bit more about the nature of this political structure. You see, one of the most important steps in revisiting history is returning to the sources themselves. We often hear sweeping claims about Majapahit's greatness, but when we actually look at the original text, like, for example, the Sawarnanya, or also known as nowadays as Negara Kertagama, other stone inscriptions, or even foreign accounts such as Chinese records, what do these sources actually tell us? As in, how far did Majapahit's authority or influence actually extend? I guess, more broadly, should we even think of it as a centralized empire in the modern sense, or is there a better framework for understanding what kind of polity truly Majapahit was?
Thank you for asking about sources. This is really the most important aspect of our discussion. When we talk about historical events and historical phenomena, we need to always go back to not just knowing what the sources are and what they say, but understanding their nature, because different kinds of sources shape our understanding and our knowledge in different ways. So the sources for Majapahit, the authentic sources that tell us reliable information about what Majapahit was like, are very few. That's the first thing to note. There are very, very few sources. If we compare it to many other parts of the world, to the history of China during this period, to the history of the Middle East, or the history of Western Europe in this period, the number of primary or near primary sources that tell us about Javanese history or Indonesian history are very, very small. That's the first thing. There's three or four main types, I would say. The first you've mentioned, chronicles. So these are his texts that are written with the intention of recording some historical events. One is the Deshawarnana. This is a text written by a monk or a cleric, a Buddhist cleric in Majapahit during that time. So it's a sort of eyewitness account, but with a considerable amount of sort of literary creativity involved as well. Completed in 1365. There's also another chronicle called Pararaton. This is a later text, it's a compilation of different materials, probably put together in the 16th century, in the 1500s, but referring to events in Majapahit from the 13th, and Singosari, from the 13th through to the 15th century. So we have two chronicles only that tell us fairly reliable information about the history of Majapahit. These are both from East Java. We have no chronicles from outside Java during this period in the 14th century. So we don't have any historical accounts written in this time from the perspective of people outside Java looking at Majapahit. So that's an important thing to remember. The sources we have are the Javanese perspective on Majapahit, looking out at other parts of the archipelago and how they saw those other non-Javanese areas. The second type of sources are inscriptions, prasasti. So these are legal documents generally written on stone or metal plates, and they tell us about historical events, but usually sort of by accident or in passing. So their main purpose is a legal function. They are about the management of land primarily. So who gets to use the land, for what purpose, under whose authority, what are the conditions attached to it. Akta tanah, basically. And they often provide a lot of information about the sort of the social and economic institutions, which is really valuable for us to know. But in terms of political information, they usually tell us a little bit. They often tell us, who the king was, for example, who the ministers were, but they don't go into a lot of depth about what was going on at the time. So the good thing about the inscriptions is that they're often dated. They have specific dates, so we can make a chronology. That's the most useful part of the inscriptions for political history or for the history of the Majapahit Empire, is that we can make a clear chronology in a way that with some of the sources we can't. Then we have foreign sources, generally records written in Chinese, classical Chinese, which look at what's going on in the archipelago more broadly. And these have been used a lot by historians of Southeast Asia because they are precisely dated and because they provide sort of what was seen as a neutral and impartial perspective. I think that we can't really say that is fully true because whoever will, the Chinese historians who bring these things together had interests, they had political allegiances themselves, and when they looked at the Southeast Asian areas, they were mostly concerned with how does this information benefit us, right? How do we figure out what's going on? We have important trade relationships with Southeast Asia. They bring lots of significant goods, but sometimes there's a political problem, or sometimes the people who we favor are being oppressed by some other people we don't favor. And so we get a little bit of information from Chinese records. For example, we in the second half of the 14th century, we see how there's a bit of conflict in the Majapahit kingdom, in the royal family, between Hayam Wuruk and his uncle, and to the extent that they begin to both call themselves the king of Java and send ambassadors to China with that effect. And the Chinese are saying, why are there these two palaces? What's going on? One's in the east, one's in the west. Then later on, there's an issue where the rulers in Palembang are trying to do something autonomously, and the Chinese say, no, you are supposed to be under the authority of Java. Why are you sending us these messages? You should be going through the right channels, you know. So those are sort of small things that give us a little bit of a hint. And we really have to emphasize how, whether it's the Chinese records or the prasasti, the inscriptions, they provide us only little bits, nuggets of information. They don't provide us, only the chronicles provide us with a sort of a whole view. But the problem with the chronicles is that, one, they are from an insider's perspective, so they contain all kinds of bias. And two, they have been transmitted over time in manuscript form, being copied over and over, being recompiled and edited. So they are not as direct a source for things that were happening at that time. We have to read them critically. We have to sort of analyze them in depth in order to be able to make sure that the information that we're receiving from them is actually well transmitted. And when there are sometimes there are errors or mistakes that we detect in the text, and we have to think, this is probably because there was some problem in the copying. So particularly with the Pararaton, because the Pararaton was a text that was put together from different sources. It was not created in one go by one person, but all kinds of different extra information was added, and sometimes they overlap and sometimes they're contradictory. And one of my sort of research focuses is about how do we manage these texts that are really complex as texts when we want to use them as historical sources, right? Because historians are used to certain kinds of material, certain kinds of sources. We're used to documents, we're used to archives, we're used to documents which seem to give us sort of a hard data, which we can then integrate into a story. And when we're given with these texts that are more literary, that have complex textual structures, that might be, that might be a little bit haphazard in the way that they've been composed or compiled, we have to do some sort of textual analysis before we can really start using them as historical sources. And sometimes that's really challenging. We have to get into, all kinds of linguistic stuff, trying to figure out how these texts were composed. So the answer is that there are a number of different sources that all contain different insights into this question. None of them provide a full picture, and none of them are comprehensive, which means we need to use all of them. Right? So we need to make sure that we don't just focus on one because we like what it says or because it seems most compelling. We also have to take into account all the other ones, even if we think, but they're too fragmentary, or they're not relevant enough, or it's not getting into enough detail. We still have to take them into account.
Okay. Yeah, that's actually pretty interesting, because at the very least, to my knowledge, now the image that we have of Majapahit in the modern day Indonesia stems from an interpretation of Negara Kertagama itself, or Desa Warnanya. So I guess, would you say a problem with that is you're not being fair to other sources that exist, even though they were fragmentary?
I think that there is too much emphasis on the Desa Warnanya Negara Kertagama. It is the best source, don't get me wrong. It is the most complete and the most direct information that we can get about Majapahit. So it is completely precious source. But it's interesting for two reasons. One, even though it's been so celebrated, there are many parts of the Desa Warnanya that people don't really pay that much attention to. There's all kinds of interesting stuff, particularly in the end, towards the end part of the text, where they talk about royal court life, they talk about the dancing and the food and the ceremonies, and they talk about the bureaucratic structures, and they talk about how the agricultural policy is managed, all kinds of really fascinating social history, which is not so much focused on. Usually what people focus on when we look at this text is about the political, geopolitical stuff, the conquest and control of other parts of the archipelago by Japanese, and the role of the major figures, Hayam Wuruk, Gajah Mada. So I think that a good way of saying it is, let's enrich our interpretation of Majapahit history by focusing on particularly the inscriptions. So I think that the area for growth for us as historians of this period is the inscriptions.
Mm.
The major well-known ones have been translated, but there are ones that have been recently discovered, which have only been studied a little bit, and are yet to be fully integrated into the story. There's also a largish number of inscriptions that are not from royal palaces, but from the community. They might be from religious communities, hermitages out in the countryside, often short, but they provide an important, different perspective about Japanese life at this time. So we want to incorporate as many different perspectives, even within Java. We're not yet talking about, the empire outside Java. Even within Java, there's a lot of material that we can still investigate and study. So I think that it's about continuing to enrich our understanding and focusing on perhaps themes or topics that are not as well known to the general public. So historians know them well. I mean, people who focus and study, and archaeologists who study Majapahit, they're well aware of all of these different aspects of life that one can study, about the agricultural aspects, about the cultural, social aspects. But I think that we are in the process of doing more to bring those parts of Javanese history more to the public attention.
All right, so I would like to shift a little bit to how the image of Majapahit as a centralized and modern empire, especially in Java, was shaped in the first place. So how much of the influence of Dutch colonial scholars such as Pigeaud, Krom, or Brandes, what role did they actually have and play in constructing the version of Majapahit that many Indonesians grew up in?
Yeah. This is a really interesting dynamic, because it's always been a dynamic between Indonesian traditional knowledge and Western or modern scholarly knowledge. It's always been an interplay between the two. The scholars that you mentioned, Brandes, Krom, were operating in the late 19th, early 20th century, Pigeaud in the mid-20th century, but this issue of Majapahit was already being talked about in the beginning of Western scholarship on Java, or in the early part, in the works of people like Thomas Stamford Raffles, John Crawford, the British scholar administrators who were in Java in the early 19th century. At that time, they very much were absorbing traditional Indonesian Javanese knowledge about these things. They were collecting manuscripts. They were not so much creating as they were absorbing and interpreting and translating into English and Dutch. And so there's a phase in the early 19th century when what looks like colonial knowledge and what is presented to us as colonial knowledge, encyclopedias published in London, all these things, and with the authors claiming that they were the ones who created this scholarship, actually we see so much traditional Javanese knowledge being co-opted there. What's, I think, the next big shift, the next change in the late 19th century, when particularly Brandes is playing a major role, is that the colonial scholars, particularly those now who were attached to the Dutch institutions, that is the Batavian Society for Arts and Sciences, kind of scholarly society, like the, Indies version of the Royal Society, of which Brandes was a part, and the University of Leiden. So you have a number of important scholars there, and a number of other kind of Dutch colonial scholarly institutions. As that become more organized and as they become more institutionalized, they start to develop a sort of more rigorous scholarly method, and one which is more autonomous and more critical of the traditional knowledge. So if in the early part of the 19th century we have colonial scholars who are certainly colonialists, certainly, thinking of themselves as superior, but nevertheless, absorbing a lot of traditional knowledge, by the late 19th century, colonial scholars have a lot more self-confidence in their own methods, and they believe that they can, scientifically find the truths about Javanese history, and if necessary, criticize or reject traditional perspectives. So the key for our question about the Majapahit Empire and how knowledge of the Majapahit Empire was produced, the key is two things. One, that in the late 19th century, scholars began to be able to decipher and translate the inscriptions, which they previously had not been able to do. And two, that the scholars began to read Balinese manuscripts, which previously they had not had access to because Bali was still independent. So these are the two factors in the mid to late 19th century which really shifted the balance and the tone of scholarship on this question. Why are these two things important? Because once you're able to decipher the inscriptions, as I mentioned before, now you have chronology. So now you've got a key set of documents where you can plot out the whole of pre-Islamic Javanese history. So previously, when you're only relying on chronicles and legends and other kinds of history, the chronology was a bit shaky. They didn't have quite the certainty of events happening in particular years from the 8th century through the 15th century. But now you do. And when you've got those inscriptions, which are contemporary documents, they were written around the time the events happened, you can confidently say these are the key events, the milestones, and then the other sources become enriching of that narrative, right? So why is the Balinese manuscript material important? Because the chronicles I mentioned earlier, the Desa Warnana and the Paraton, are only preserved in the Balinese manuscript tradition. They are no longer preserved in the Javanese tradition. So before the Western scholars had access to Balinese materials, they had no access to these two chronicles. They did not know about the Pararautan, they did not know about Deshwarana. And Brandes personally was the one who is most credited with having identified, edited, and translated these texts. So Brandes was in a position, due to his institutional affiliation, to receive a lot of manuscripts from Bali. He had the training to be able to read them in the original script, the Aksara Bali, and translate them from Old Javanese. And he had an interest in presenting these texts for scholarship. So as soon as he studied them and was able to publish them, then other scholars, colonial scholars, very quickly realized how important these sources were. So Brandes, in that sense, was the one who opened the door to this historiography, due to those two reasons, because of his access to inscriptions and because of his access to Balinese manuscripts. Then the sort of next generation, of which N.J. Krom was the kind of leading figure as a historian, began to develop the narrative and the story. So they've now got access to these sources. They're discovering new inscriptions regularly in the early 20th century. They're doing a lot of archaeological work. Again, more institutionalization. So the Archaeological Bureau was founded. Well, first the Archaeological Commission, the Archaeological Bureau, the Netherlands Indies was created around this early 20th century time. So with this funding, with this structure, more and more research was able to be done. And people like Krom were able to begin to develop a coherent narrative. So Krom really was the one who, for the first time, put together all of the different bits of evidence that had been collected and said, here's the story, right? This is how it all fits together in his major work, which is called Hindu-Javanese History. So this is a Dutch sort of major textbook that he put together in 2 editions in the 1920s and 30s. And that became the Bible of the history of this period. He became the authority. People would go to him to understand how it all fit together. And then this textbook, or this reference work, was very quickly then adapted for broader audiences. So Krom's work is very scholarly, it's very heavy, it's dense, it's very, very long, difficult Dutch, it's tough going. Very quickly, the Dutch people in the Indies thought, no, we need to make this more accessible. They began to make more accessible, abridged, shorter versions of it in Dutch. And at this same time, as you will well know, this is also the period when there's a generation or two of Dutch-educated Indonesians coming through the system. It's a period of Sukarno and Yahya Dewan Toro and all these people who are sort of becoming more and more aware of the value of Western education for the purposes of emancipating Indonesian people and working towards a sort of the freedom, right? A sort of national liberation. So they're also reading these works in Dutch because they can, and they are absorbing these ideas. So it's really in this early 20th century period that the Indonesians are starting to absorb these ideas through Dutch, and then at the end of the Dutch period into the World War, quite quickly able to then translate those ideas into Indonesian. So once Dutch is pushed aside as the language of education and Indonesian replaces it, these people are ready. These early Indonesian nationalists are ready. They've had the education, they've read Krom, they've read these scholars. Some important nationalist figures were actually scholars of these texts. So Priyono is an important figure who did his PhD in Leiden, studying this old Javanese material. Then he came back to Indonesia and played a major role in the nationalist period.
So following on from that, after the Indonesians being exposed to Dutch and Western education in general, I'm curious about how this narrative has evolved in more recent times. That is, after independence, especially during the New Order, how was the story of Majapahit institutionalized in national historiography? And even today, in things like school curricula, museums, or public commemorations, how is this narrative still being reproduced?
The important thing to think about nationalist historiography is that it started as soon as nationalism did. So it was not just the New Order. And it's interesting to look at how the Majapahit story evolved, particularly in the pre-New Order period. So what used to be called Orde Lama.
Yeah, it is.
Because what we see is a lot of contestation around the question of Majapahit already at that time. People were already feeling that this was an issue that had important implications for modern national unity. We see that nationalist figures who were, let's say, pro-centralization, so pro-Jakarta, certainly Sukarno, but also non-Javanese people like Muhammad Yamin, often associated with the left or left-leaning, they were very in favor of this idea of Majapahit as a great nation. And part of it is that Sukarno in particular was looking for ways to develop a national identity and pride. And he was very explicit about his mission of nation building, using our symbols, using our historical legacies as a way of empowering Indonesians today and empowering the Indonesian nation state at a time when it's fair to say Indonesia was under threat in a number of ways, right? That even after independence had been achieved, there was political military tensions with neighbours, with British. There was all kinds of internal problems of unity and regions in Indonesia that felt that they were not being properly represented, properly treated within the Indonesian nation state. So this is the context in which a lot of this early Majapahit nationalist narrative emerges. This attempt by people who pro-national unity, specifically a Jakarta-centric, state-centric national unity, to say, look at Majapahit, also to a lesser extent Sriwijaya, but Majapahit was the main historical reference. Look how they were so united under Gajah Mada. Look how they were so powerful against their neighbors, against their enemies. We ought to emulate that. And then at the same time, there were people who opposed that idea because they saw it as Java-centric, because they saw it as, this is actually not a good story about national unity. This is a bad story about Javanese imperialism oppressing the non-Javanese people on the other islands. So, for example, one of the leaders of sort of separatist movements in Sulawesi, Kahar Muzakar, wrote about this, what he called the new Majapahitism, the sort of ideology that was being imposed from the center upon the people, the non-Javanese people throughout the archipelago, compelling them to conform to the authority of the central state, which was dominated by Javanese people. So already in the 50s, there was this contestation. Then, when the new order came to power, as part of a broader attempt to define a national history narrative, the new order, due to the extreme violence with which it came to power, needed to have a very strongly controlled narrative about the whole history of Indonesia. And that included the very early history, Majapahit. And the way in which the New Order historians focused on very specific aspects of the Majapahit story. That is, they focused on the figure of Gajah Mada almost more than Hayam Wuruk. And that's actually something which is reflected in the evidence. If we sort of look at the role of Gajah Mada as a prime minister, it seems that he was more politically effective in his period than Hayam Wuruk, who overlapped with him but was of the generation below. So the new order focused on Gajah Mada in particular. They focused not only on the information from the Desa Warnana, but also from the information about Gajah Mada from the Pararaton. Specifically, in the Pararaton, there is the story of the Sumpah Palapa, Palapa Oath, in which Gajah Mada declares in an assembly that he won't enjoy Palapa, whatever that. We don't know exactly what Palapa really means. It seems to mean something like taking rest or leave, sabbatical. He won't do that until all of the Nusantara are defeated. Right? So it's really important that we look at the wording that he uses. He says, Namun huwus Nusantara kalah. So his language is highly militaristic, and it's about the conquest and defeat of the Nusantara, the other islands, the non-Javanese peoples. And then he lists various places that he wants to conquer. This was sort of sanitized in the New Order retelling as he made an oath to unify the archipelago. But it's very clear in the original that he did not see the Nusantara as a single unity that he was bringing together. He saw Java as a unity and the other islands as external places that he wanted to dominate and control and defeat. That aspect of Gajah Mada's story is one which the New Order emphasized significantly. It's fairly clear why, because the New Order itself is a military regime, and so they wanted to emphasize that unity could only be achieved through military domination. That just as Gajah Mada needed to militarily defeat his enemies in order to achieve unity, the new order needed to use military means to defeat its enemies to achieve national unity. So very clear parallel being drawn between the new order conception of how one obtains political unity and the value of it and the means by which we should do it, and the specific aspects of Majapahit history which they emphasized. And it has to be said that for all of the new order's glorification of Majapahit and of Gajah Mada, they were not particularly supportive of real research into Majapahit. They didn't suppress it, except for a few instances. So, for example, there's an important scholar, Slamet Mulyana, who did experience a bit of censorship, a bit of his books, not being allowed, because he presented some views about Majapahit which were not very welcomed by the new order government. Specifically, he emphasized the importance of Chinese people in the Majapahit period and their role in contributing to Japanese culture, including to Islamization. This was a perspective that wasn't welcomed by the new order. By and large, the government was not tolerant of perspectives that differed from the line that they had created, and the focus on Japanese militarism, which they saw as the most valuable aspect of the Majapahit legacy. So this was a story that we, as students, certainly I, because I was a student at the end of the new order, experienced through the school system. So I think that things are different now to a degree. This is my impression, although I don't teach in schools in Indonesia, but my understanding of people who have gone through since and people who do, who are teachers and communicate with students in Indonesia in the decades since the new order fell, the basic framework seems to be still in place, but it appears to be enriched in various ways. That is, it's not so focused in the way that the new order story used to be on only a few key things. There seems to be much more interest among students and teachers in the more holistic aspects of Majapahit history. What was Majapahit everyday life like? What would people eat? What did people, what were gender relations like in Majapahit? What did people wear? What about the temples that we see? What was their religion like? There's more, I think, interest in diverse experiences of this historical period. We know about it because of the glorious story and all of this stuff that was, the basic framework. But I think that there's a great deal more curiosity, and there is still a lot more freedom now than it was during the Suharto period for people to explore alternative narratives. So I think that overall is sort of how it's panned out. The basic framework of the narrative of the nationalist perspective has always been there. It changes from time to time, depending on the government in power and the political climate. But there's always room for it to be taken in a different direction. I think that's what we see, in recent years, is people like yourselves, bring these questions into discussion, thinking about, well, how can we think of it differently? What are the things that we need to reconsider? So I think that what you guys are doing and what this sort of approach is about is absolutely in keeping with that movement to reconsider and try and diversify our understanding of this historical narrative that we've inherited.
This is such complex conversation. But I do remember vividly I learned in primary school, in terms of Sumpah Palapa, yes, it's about unification. It's about, okay, we want to, gather around and, just become this one powerful nation. But instead, there's actually history.
The translation was always to unify, avoiding words like conquest, subjugate, defeat. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, but that actually brings us into a bigger question about the role of history, especially in society. What are the risks or dangers, in your view, in your own personal opinion, of holding into inaccurate historical narratives, especially in those narratives are used to support modern nation building or political agendas?
It's a really important balance, I think. We, as historians, and particularly those who are sort of trained as historians, we have some, I guess, values, intellectual values that we hold to, which is that we aim towards certain ways of looking at the past. We aim for impartiality, many of us. We aim for evidence-based claims. We aim for systematic methods. We aim for fair judgment between different perspectives. And these are all values that are, one, specific to the history discipline, but they reflect and are grounded in broader values, right? They're broader values about how we should relate to each other, how we should deal with diversity and difference, how we should relate to the world around us, to what extent we should value scientific methods, evidence-based methods, all these things. So as a historian, it's easy to say, well, everybody should reflect my values more, right? Everyone should be better historians. They should be more critical. They should be more analytical. They should be more like me with my training and my background and my values. And I would say that that's fair to say because those are values which, as I said, reflect, they're more general than just for historians, right? They're not just about the past. They're also about how we understand the world around us more broadly. But the other consideration there is that our perspective on history is always going to be informed by our values. It's always going to be affected and shaped by the things that we think are important. And those two things are not necessarily in conflict, but they can be. So this is the difficult part. It's like, we can't pretend to be robots and say, I am not going to let my value systems, my beliefs, have any effect on my pure scientific perspective on the past. That's not reasonable. It's not pragmatic. It's not practical. There will always be an effect. And so the responsible thing to do is to acknowledge what your perspective is. So, for example, make it concrete. I don't share the New Borders perspective on the Majapahit Empire fairly clearly, right? I don't believe that the most valuable and important thing about the Majapahit Empire was its military power and its capacity to dominate non-Javanese people. I think that that's not a good part of the history, and it's not something that we should seek to emulate. It did happen to some degree. So there's evidence that, Majapahit did launch strikes against other parts of the archipelago, that they were able to impose military might at certain times, but not others along areas. So it's the truth. It's as far as we can tell, the evidence points to that being a reality. So we can't deny that it happened. We can't say, oh, no, there was never any violence. Majapahit was always just a peaceful diplomatic enterprise, right? Because the evidence doesn't support that. At the same time, we can also say, well, we can argue that these things were the case as far as we can tell from the limited evidence we have, but let's not make that the be-all and end-all of our story. Let's not make that the center of everything. Let's also consider the importance of Majapahit religious institutions, for example. So there's a little bit of evidence that Majapahit institutions, sort of monks and clerics, would go out and sort of not quite proselytize, but they would help to build religious institutions, monasteries, and temples outside of Java that were along the Javanese model, like inspired by the Javanese system, which I think is a really interesting fact, right? Like it makes us think, well, part of your question was, well, what about political but also social and cultural influences? That could be one of them, right? We need a bit more research to find out exactly how it all worked, but there's a hint there in the sources. So there are all kinds of interesting avenues that we can take. But to go back to your main question, this issue of critical scientific perspective on history versus the nationalist patriotic one was one, again, that was already being debated in the 50s in Indonesia. Already big discussions that among leading intellectuals in 1950s Indonesia about, well, what's the point of doing history? What's the purpose of it? And some people were saying, it's an intellectual endeavor. It's about again, very values. So let me exemplify. There was a particular debate in 1957 between two important figures, Sujat Moko, who was I guess a liberal-oriented, Western-educated intellectual, and Muhammad Yamin, who had been a sort of leftist student activist during the war and had become a sort of nationalist, sort of advocate, nationalist politician. And they debated history, and they debated the question of what is the purpose of history. And Sujat Moko said the purpose of history is to be a science, and that's important because it will advance us intellectually. That is, it will make Indonesians more critical, more rational. It will allow us to free ourselves from superstition, free ourselves from propaganda, free ourselves from these mental constraints that have been holding us back so many centuries. And then Yamin responded and said the point of history is to build a sense of national solidarity and identity. So in a context where we've been divided and colonized and we lack a sense of togetherness, the point of history is not pure science and fact gathering. It's not purely intellectual. It's actually political. It's about building solidarity. It's about giving Indonesians a sense of continuity with the past, of providing an understanding of their capacity for greatness, in a context where that greatness and even that sort of human dignity of Indonesians had been so trampled upon due to colonialism, due to the violence of the war, due to that long history of injustice. Right? So, framed like that, it's hard to know which side to take.
Yeah.
Both seem to have merit, I think. Both perspectives have value because they're coming from position of value, right? Yes, different sets of values, perhaps. One perhaps a bit more communitarian, a bit more about solidarity, or one a little bit more individualistic, a little bit more liberal, small L liberal perspective. But still, I think there are merits to both sides. Now, since I'm a professional historian, I might, by inclination, and especially given the sort of nationalist legacy that we've talked about and the way in which in Indonesia the state has been so domineering of historical narrative, I would probably end up, thinking we need a bit more Sujat Moko, right? Well, the rest, yeah, I mean, but the point I'm trying to make is that those two perspectives come from a position of value each. And so I think that the question about, well, what do we do now? I guess, which is where you were getting at, is I think on the one hand, it's really important to have the capacity to do critical history. That is, to develop the skills and to nurture those institutions, just like they had back in the Dutch colonial period. I mean, the Dutch could only have achieved that knowledge production through their institutions. I think it's really important. It was not as though there was some sort of intrinsic geniuses. They were very smart people, but the reason they were able to accomplish and produce that new knowledge was because they had resources, they had institutions, they had budgets, which allowed them to do it, right? And the colonial government invested in that. We ought to continue to do the same. We should keep doing it. In Indonesia, we do have the institutions. We can continue to build them. We can continue to support them and enrich them, and we must do that. So we've got to have the skills available, including, training people to read Old Javanese and, fund excavations. I mean, there are so many sites in Java, and the people who excavate them are very hardworking, but there's so much to do. There's so many new discoveries out there, and everyone needs support. Everyone needs more, more collaboration, more funding, more institutional backing. So that's, I think, what's really important about that side. Yes, it's important to develop critical thinking skills. And I think that not currently living in Indonesia, so I don't have my finger on the pulse so much. But my impression is actually that critical thinking is going pretty well in Indonesia. It basically is going pretty well. I think that there's always, like in any country, there's always, problems, there's misinformation, there's always, but there is I think a strong tradition, and there always has been a strong tradition in Indonesia of critical thinking, of intellectual curiosity, of openness to experience. Sometimes that has been put under pressure by the state in particular, or by elements in society that see that as a threat, of course. But what country is free of that these days? I mean, every country, no matter how democratic we claim to be, we experience that sort of thing. So I'm fairly optimistic about Indonesians' capacity to engage with these problems, in a robust and critical way. What I'm a bit more worried about is the institutional capacity. That I hope that all of the institutions that are around knowledge production, both in Indonesia, but also those of us overseas who work in Indonesia, right? I mean, we also have a big responsibility here at the ANU and other parts of the global scholarly community to help keep building those institutions, keep building those training programs, keep building the funding streams that will support publication, excavation, all of these things, because dissemination really important, like what you guys are doing, right?
Yeah.
Sharing, interpreting that knowledge. The raw materials are there, the intelligence is there, the critical thinking is there, the curiosity is there, which is the most important thing, right? Young people are curious about it. They want to know about Majapahit. They want to know whether it's really the way that they learned it. So I think that there's hope and enthusiasm, and the way to kind of realize some of that is to think about, okay, well, what practical things can we do? How can we build up the infrastructure that we need in order to be able to keep developing our knowledge and enriching our perspectives on this period?
What did you think? Because sometimes we get so ambitious in removing bias and being opposed to bias, while bias is now part of the narrative to tell. And what can we do? Keep reading, keep continually producing more conversation about this, and intriguing. It's intriguing.
As we near the end of our conversation, I'd like to ask something that often comes up when we challenge dominant historical narratives. Do you think critical history, especially one that questions national myths, can still resonate with national pride, or does it inevitably come into conflict with it? And if it does come conflict with national pride, how might Indonesian historians and students engage critically with the past while still fostering a meaningful sense of pride within their national identity?
I think this is a really great question. Thank you for asking it. The first part of my response is to say national pride means a lot of different things. And that's how we understand what we are proud of is a reflection of our values. If we are proud of our military power, of our conquest of other nations, of the greatness of our state and our domination of territory. That reflects our values. If we're proud of our cultural achievements, the beauty of the art that was produced by our ancestors, the richness of the narratives that are passed down, the various traditions and customs that we see all over, if we're proud of that, then that's a reflection of our values. If we're proud of our environment, if we're proud of the beauty of the natural environment, if we seek to protect it, if we look back at how peoples throughout the past have had a healthy, caring relationship to the lands in which they live and the forests in which they existed and the seas in which they fished and drew life from, that's a reflection of our values. So in a way, I'm answering your question with another question. When we talk about national pride, what are we proud of? And that has to guide our perspective. Now, I've been thinking a lot about the work of a very dear senior of mine, who's recently passed away, Emeritus Professor Anthony Reid. He was a significant mentor to me when I was first beginning as a historian. And since his passing, I've been reading again his works. And one thing that really struck me was how his sense of values shined through his historical writing and his most rigorous analysis of the sources, but nevertheless still with a very clear sense of what we might call pride, or certainly values. And when he wrote about Indonesian history as a non-Indonesian, he resonated most with those parts of Indonesian history that maybe had not been so well known or celebrated by the national state or by the national, but which he felt was something that was of great value. Instances where Indonesian communities were very open to cosmopolitan influences, very, very invested in open trade, for example, on the seas, opposing the Dutch monopoly, trying to develop a sense of autonomy and self-determination, even in the context of colonial pressures. These were things that he saw as valuable. The importance of women, for example, in the economic systems of Indonesia and the cultural transmission throughout all different periods of Indonesian history. So these are things I think one ought to be proud of, right? These are things which are part of national pride. The question then is, how do we think about national pride in the present? What are we proud of now? Are we proud of our diversity? I think most Indonesians are. I think most Indonesians, without denying that there are challenges like in any country, some of them worse in Indonesia than in other countries, some of them not as bad, about the way in which we deal with the differences that we have amongst ourselves and particularly the power imbalances that often emerge from difference, ethnic difference, religious difference. Nevertheless, I think that most Indonesians have a basic commitment to the idea of diversity, that we ultimately value it and respect them. So that's an approach, right? Then we think, okay, well, how does that tie into critical history, right? Is it in conflict? Well, sometimes it is in conflict. If our commitment to a particular set of values leads us to not accept or to reject historical facts or historical evidence. And I want to say, in this period, for the Majapahit period, for the pre-modern history in general, there are very few facts which are absolutely rock solid. Most facts are valid, but have some degree of uncertainty, and we have to accept that, right? That's the nature of the field, that's the nature of the evidence. The evidence tells us some things, but there's a lot that it doesn't tell us. So part of it being critical is not just saying these are the facts, and if you disagree with them, you're wrong, but this is what we can know. This is what the evidence points to, and this is a balanced interpretation of the evidence, and that is an unbalanced interpretation of the evidence. So that's when critical history does take a sort of opposing stance to maybe patriotic perspectives, is when those nationalist perspectives generate unbalanced or unfair judgments. That is, there's a bunch of evidence, but they only look at the most pleasing parts and they ignore the less pleasing parts, or they distort the meaning, for example, of some of the phrases, like we were talking before about sumpah palapa, right? Putting a spin on it that really is not a fair or not a balanced interpretation of what's going on. So in the end, unfortunately, the answer to your question is a bit of both. Critical history can be oppositional, it can be critical of a national pride perspective if that national pride perspective is grounded in a sort of attempt to force the evidence into some preconceived narrative. On the other hand, if we allow the evidence to be there in its fullness, and if we interpret it in line with our values, so not saying that we can be unbiased ever, completely unbiased, but doing our best to take the evidence as fairly as we believe we can, and being open about our own values and how those values inform what we are interested in, what topics we want to study, what ones we don't, how we interpret that. If we're open about that, then I think that in the end, the evidence will provide us with a lot more to be proud about, right? And it will provide us with a much richer base for national pride beyond the fairly sometimes narrow perspectives that the state imposes on us. Be proud of Indonesia because of only this.
To close, Dr. Sastrawan, we'd love to hear your personal reflections. What do you think Indonesian scholars and students, especially those who studying abroad, just like us, can do to build a more nuanced and historical grounded understanding of Indonesia's past?
I think that there are lots of things that we can all do to keep developing and enriching our perspective on the past, of Indonesia's past, and of this early period. I think that first we want to build awareness or understanding of the sources. I think it's a challenging but important thing to do. So we don't want to be in a situation where diversifying our perspectives on history is just about having another version, version A, version B, version C, and then we think, well, all these different versions, which one's more right? The danger with that is that we end up just contending, and without getting to a sort of any sort of middle ground, shared ground, let's say, we don't end up progressing because we associate, well, this perspective is at worst this professor's perspective and this other professor's perspective, and we end up just following authorities. So we don't really want to go there. So I think the real aim, and there are a number of Indonesian people now who I think are doing a great job of this, is when it comes to outreach and sharing the knowledge about history and the past, it's more than just here's another version. It's actually, well, here's the evidence for it. This is how we even begin to know about Majapahit. So a bit of the things that we were talking about before, about the sources and what they're like. I think that's an important starting point, right? So it doesn't mean that we all have to suddenly become, ancient historians by profession, but I think it's good for there to be a baseline public understanding of how history is done, practically, how the sources are put together, particularly when it's our own history, particularly when it's Indonesian history. It's good to know that how do we know about the Majapahit Empire? Well, because of these texts, because of these inscriptions. What do they say? Well, sometimes they say this, but sometimes it's a bit contradictory. We don't have to go into great depth necessarily, but being aware, and I think that this sort of more already being done for modern history, This is my impression. Partly because modern history is always a bigger field, there's always got people involved. But I think now there is more and more public discussion about the practical approaches to history. So when there's a controversy or a discussion about some historical event, people are in public talking about, well, what's the evidence for this? What's the evidence for that? What's the nature of evidence? What's the value of, say, oral history or oral testimony in establishing whether things happened or how they happened? What's the evidence? What's the value of other kinds of evidence beyond just archival resources? So the more that those sorts of toolkit of doing history is something which everybody publicly feels like they've got a stake in, I think that's really the important approach, right? So it's not that, okay, you've got these historians and you put them in the campus and they work away and then they produce a history book that you then absorb. Right? It's important that they do research, it's important that they produce knowledge, and I and others continue to publish and create things. But the purpose is not for them to all to accept my version and be like, well, no, this is what the historian says, but rather to say, here's some new evidence that I've obtained through this research. Here's a new perspective that I gained by reading this scholar who has a different perspective to what I knew and grew up with. Oh, wow, actually, I didn't realize we could look at it this way. And that leads you to think. I feel that sometimes we can be, in general, Indonesian people can be a bit minder, yeah? They can be a little bit.
Oh, I see.
We can be a little bit lacking in confidence to say, this is my opinion, because maybe we're not an expert, but we still can have an opinion, and it's still important that our opinion is based on evidence, that it's based on a good reasoning, that it's based on a set of values that we understand and are open about. So I think that the more that the Indonesian people and people like yourself, people who are studying, feel a sense of, okay, well, I might not be a professional historian, but still it's important to me. I have a stake in it, and I've got some knowledge and I've got some resources available to me, and I will, think about it and come up with my own opinion. So making it public, very important. It's a public good. History is not just for the state to give to you and for you to absorb. It's something which belongs to the public, and we all have a different role in that. Some of us might have a more professional role, and we might be in a more research part of it, but ordinary citizens have a role, and their role is to think about history, to understand what we can know about it, to understand how our different perspectives influence our understanding of it, and to participate, I think, in those discussions in a constructive way, to help support and build those institutions that give us opportunity to keep engaging with it. So, yeah, I think that there's a lot of hope. There's a lot of enthusiasm among particularly young Indonesians, and I'm therefore really grateful that you guys invited me and that you're really open to these discussions, because the momentum is there. I feel like we don't need to be too pessimistic about Indonesia, particularly Indonesians, youth, young people. The energy is there, the knowledge is there, but it's just a matter of continuing on that path and really committing to this idea that this belongs to all of us in all our different ways, right? It's not one single thing that someone can determine for all of us and we'll have to follow. It's shared amongst us, and we all have different ways into it, different backgrounds, different beliefs, different I guess resources that we have to draw on. But nevertheless, we all have a responsibility as well to build this together. So I think that's where the working together, the collaboration between, I guess, critical, professional, historical approaches and the public, perhaps national way of going about history.
Dr. Sastrawan, thank you so much for sharing your time It's been incredibly enlightening, at least for me, to unpack the history, Majapahit, and of course, historical narratives, and how can we actually perceive the notion of history.
Yes, and once again, we thank you so much for coming to this episode. This conversation reminds us that history is not just about the past, it's also how we imagine who we are today and who we want to become as a society.
And for our listeners, whether you're tuning in on campus, back home, here in Australia, or any parts of the world, we hope this episode can encourage you to keep asking questions about the stories that we've inherited and to the ones that we're going to tell.
If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to check out our other discussions on ANUISA Roundtable Talks. You can find us on YouTube or at anuisa.org.
And until next time, stay curious, stay critical, and thank you for being part of the conversation.
Sampai jumpa. See you in the next episode.